The motorcycle was already tipping over the edge and the girl was already losing her grip, when Dion, a homeless boy who hadn't eaten in 2 days, became the only person on that bridge who moved. He grabbed her with everything he had and pulled her back from 130 feet of freezing darkness, saving her life with nothing but his bare hands. But the moment her eyes opened and she whispered her last name, Dion's blood ran cold, because that name meant 220 bikers were about to descend on New York. And not all of them were coming for the reason everyone thought. Before we continue, hit that like button and subscribe so this story doesn't get away from you. Drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching from? I read every single one. Now let's enjoy the story together. The Brooklyn Bridge at 2 a.m. in February is not a place for the living. It belongs to the wind, to the fog that rolls off the East River in thick, suffocating sheets. To the kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin, it gets inside your bones and sets up residence there like it owns the place. The bridge lights fight against the darkness but never quite win, casting everything in a pale, sickly yellow glow that makes the world look like an old photograph of itself. Most people who cross it at that hour do so quickly, heads down, collars up, wanting nothing more than to be somewhere else. Dion was not most people. Not because he was brave. Not because he was special. But because he had nowhere else to be. He moved across the pedestrian walkway with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had learned that speed costs energy and energy was currency he couldn't afford to waste. His jacket, a gray hoodie layered under a cracked vinyl windbreaker he'd pulled from a donation bin outside a church on Fulton Street, did almost nothing against the February air. His sneakers had a hole above the left toe that let the cold in like an open invitation. The backpack on his shoulders held everything he owned in the world. A change of socks, a broken compass that hadn't pointed north in 3 months, and a sketchbook so worn at the spine that he held it together with a rubber band. He was 16 years old, and the city of New York did not know he existed. He'd been heading for the Foot Green warming shelter on DeKalb Avenue, a place that kept its doors open until 3 a.m. on weeknights and smelled permanently of industrial cleaner and other people's misery, but was warm, which was the only thing that mattered on a night like this. He had maybe 40 minutes to get there before capacity locked him out for the night. He knew the walk. He'd done it before. Crossed the bridge, cut through the heights, down Flatbush, left on DeKalb. Simple. Mechanical. The kind of route that lets your mind go somewhere else while your feet handle the business. His mind was somewhere else entirely when he heard it. Not a sound he could immediately name. Not a crash, not a horn, not the usual mechanical language of the bridge at night. Something underneath all of that. Something that cut through the wind and the distant hum of the city the way a knife cuts through water, clean and sudden and wrong. He stopped walking. Every instinct he'd spent 7 months sharpening on the streets of Brooklyn fired simultaneously, and he turned toward the sound before his brain had even finished processing what it was. Through the fog, maybe 60 feet ahead, he saw the motorcycle. A Harley-Davidson Heritage Classic, or what was left of one, jammed at a brutal angle against a section of bridge railing that had clearly already been weakened before tonight. The front wheel was over the edge, spinning slowly in the open air above 130 feet of black, freezing East River. The bike groaned against the metal like something alive and in pain, the weight of it shifting incrementally, inch by terrible inch, toward the point of no return. And pinned beneath the handlebars, one hand gripping the railing and the other pressed against a gash above her left eye that was painting her face red, was a girl. She couldn't have been older than 17. Her helmet was gone. Somewhere on the bridge behind her or already in the river below, impossible to know. Her eyes were half open, moving in the slow, unfocused way of someone whose body was beginning to shut down a conversation her mind wasn't ready to end. Her lips were moving but nothing was coming out. Or maybe something was coming out and the wind was taking it before it could reach him. Dion looked left. He looked right. A single car had slowed 50 yards back, hazard lights blinking, but nobody was getting out. Nobody was running. Nobody was doing anything except watching through glass, warm and safe and paralyzed by the particular human instinct that tells you someone else will handle it. Nobody else was going to handle it. He dropped his backpack and ran. The railing was cold enough to burn when he grabbed it. He threw one leg over, then the other, and suddenly there was nothing beneath his feet but the lowest rung of the guardrail and 130 feet of dark air and darker water below. The wind hit him from 3 directions at once. His fingers went numb in seconds. He pressed himself flat against the outside of the railing and moved laterally toward her, hand over hand, the metal vibrating under his grip every time the motorcycle shifted its weight. She saw him when he was about 4 feet away. Her eyes found his and something moved through them. Not quite hope, because hope requires a clarity of mind she no longer fully had, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like the last reserves of a person's will deciding to hold on for one more minute. He reached her, got one arm under hers, felt the full dead weight of her and the bike pulling against him like the river below had already decided she was coming and was simply waiting on the formality. He pulled. His sneakers had no grip. His arms had no real strength. Not the kind that comes from being fed and rested and built for moments like this. What he had instead was something that doesn't have a clean name. Something that lives below muscle and bone in a place most people never have to access. He pulled from there, from whatever that place is, and she moved. A fraction. Then another fraction. The motorcycle groaned and tilted further, and for one single second the entire weight of it transferred through her body into his arms, and he felt his fingers begin to slip from the railing, and he thought, with the strange, calm clarity that only exists at the edge of death, this is how it ends. It didn't end. He found another half-inch of grip, planted his left foot against a bolt in the railing's lower frame, and pulled one final time with everything left in him. They fell backward onto the walkway together, Dion flat on his back, the girl collapsed across him, both of them breathing in the ragged, desperate way of people who have just negotiated with something they weren't supposed to survive. Behind them, freed of her weight, the Harley tipped silently over the edge. The fall lasted long enough that Dion had time to hear the wind moving around it before the impact came up from below. A distant, final crash that echoed once off the bridge supports and then was swallowed entirely by the river. He lay there for a moment staring up at the yellow bridge lights and the fog moving across them. His hands were shaking. His left shoulder felt like something inside it had been rearranged. The cold was so complete he couldn't tell where his body ended and the night began. The girl was breathing beside him. Slow, shallow, but breathing. An MTA bus driver who had seen everything from the opposite lane had already called 911. Dion could hear the sirens starting somewhere in the distance over the bridge. He sat up, looked at the girl, looked at the blood still moving down her face in thin, steady lines. He pressed the sleeve of his windbreaker against the gash above her eye and held it there, and she turned her face slightly toward the pressure the way people do in moments when the body is wiser than the mind. Her lips moved again. This time the wind didn't take it. She said her last name. One word. Barely more than a breath. Dion heard it, and every hair on the back of his neck stood up at once, because he knew that name. Everyone in 3 states who had ever spent time on the wrong side of invisible lines knew that name. It wasn't just a name. It was a signal, a warning, a declaration of exactly what kind of man her father was and exactly what kind of world she came from. The sirens were getting closer. Dion looked at the girl one more time. Then he stood up, picked up his backpack, and walked into the fog in the opposite direction of the sound. By the time the first patrol car crossed onto the bridge, the walkway held nothing but a girl, a damaged railing, and the faint outline of 2 shoe prints in the frost. The boy was already gone. But somewhere in Newark, New Jersey, a phone was ringing. And the man who answered it would make sure the whole world felt it by morning. The ironbound district of Newark, New Jersey does not sleep the way other neighborhoods sleep. It doesn't go quiet so much as it goes still. The Portuguese restaurants pulling their chairs in off the sidewalks, the bodegas dropping their security grates, The streets emptying out until the only things moving are the occasional cab cutting through on Ferry Street and the cold wind coming off the Passaic River 2 blocks east. It is the kind of stillness that feels temporary. Like the neighborhood is simply catching its breath before the next thing happens. 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday in February. The next thing was happening inside Reyes Metal Works. From the outside it looked like every other collision repair shop on the block. A wide roll-up garage door, a hand-painted sign above it in faded red and black, the permanent smell of primer and burnt metal hanging in the air around the entrance like a second address. The lights inside were still on, which was not unusual for this particular shop. Reyes Metal Works kept irregular hours. The neighbors had learned not to notice. Inside, past the legitimate front of the operation, the actual cars in various states of repair, the tool chests, the alignment racks, there was a back room. Heavy door. No handle on the outside. The kind of room that existed in buildings all over Newark and Philadelphia and Baltimore and said nothing out loud but communicated everything to anyone who needed to understand it. 8 men sat around a long table in that room. The meeting had been running for 2 hours. It was the kind of meeting where nobody took notes and nobody needed to, because everything discussed lived in memory or nowhere at all. Empty coffee cups. An ashtray with 1 cigarette still burning. A single overhead bulb throwing hard shadows across faces that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. At the head of the table sat Aurelio Reyes. Most people in that room called him Iron Duke. Most people outside that room called him nothing at all, because most people outside that room had enough sense to make sure they never had a reason to refer to him directly. He was 51 years old and built like the kind of man who had been tested repeatedly by the physical world and had repeatedly declined to be broken by it. The scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw was old enough that it had long since stopped telling its own story and simply become part of his face, the way a river becomes part of a landscape. His hands rested flat on the table in front of him. Still, deliberate, the hands of a man who had learned that stillness communicates more than movement ever could. He was listening to Wrench finish a sentence when the phone rang. Not his charter phone. Not the business line. The other one. The one that lived in his left inside pocket and had a number known to exactly 4 people on Earth. He felt it before he heard it, a single vibration against his chest, and the room noticed the way he reached for it because that particular pocket and that particular phone had never rung during a meeting before. He looked at the screen. His face changed in a way that was almost imperceptible. Almost. He stood up and walked to the corner of the room before he answered, which told every man at that table everything they needed to know about the severity of what was happening without a single word being exchanged. The conversation lasted 40 seconds. Iron Duke said nothing for the first 30 of them. He asked 1 question in the final 10. Then he ended the call and stood facing the corner wall for a moment that stretched long enough to become its own kind of statement. When he turned around, his face was composed. Completely, deliberately composed, the way a man composes himself when the alternative is something he refuses to allow in front of other people. He set the phone face down on the table. He sat back down. And then he said nothing. The silence that followed lasted 8 seconds. Wrench Dominguez counted them later, privately, because those 8 seconds stayed with him in the way that certain silences do. The kind that contain entire storms inside them while showing nothing on the surface. He had ridden with Aurelio Reyes for 19 years. He had seen him in situations that would have broken most men into pieces before they even understood what was happening. He had never seen him silent in quite this way. Not the silence of a man thinking. The silence of a man deciding what kind of man he was going to be in the next 60 seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was level, measured. Each word placed down carefully like something fragile. He said 3 things. He named a location. He named a time. He said 2 words after that. Full colors. Then he looked at Wrench and said 1 more thing, quietly enough that only Wrench caught it. Wrench nodded once and left the room immediately. Within 20 minutes, 7 phones rang across 7 cities. Newark, Trenton, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Albany, Hartford, Providence, Each call lasted under a minute. Each recipient asked no questions. By 3:30 a.m., encrypted messages were moving between chapter officers up and down the entire eastern seaboard, and men who had been asleep were pulling on leather and checking fuel gauges and moving with the quiet, purposeful efficiency of people responding to something they had always known might come but had hoped wouldn't. 220 men. 7 cities. 1 location. 1 time. No explanation given. None asked for. By 4 a.m. the first signs reached the outside world. A police scanner in lower Manhattan caught unusual radio traffic near the New Jersey approaches. A reporter at New York One News named Brianna Solis, working a routine overnight shift and monitoring 3 scanners simultaneously out of professional habit, caught the edge of it and posted a cautious, 2-sentence alert on her professional account. She wasn't sure what she was looking at yet. She was sure enough to flag it. By 4:15 a.m., Brianna's post had been shared 1,100 times. By 4:30 a.m., the NYPD's Joint Operations Center had opened an active threat assessment file. The New Jersey State Police had 2 units quietly repositioning toward the Goethals Bridge. The FBI's Newark field office had a duty agent making calls he wasn't fully authorized to make at that hour but was making anyway because the alternative, being the person who didn't make them, was worse. The city was waking up to something it couldn't name yet. That particular kind of alarm. The one that precedes understanding. Spread through Brooklyn and lower Manhattan the way cold spreads through a room when a window is opened. People felt it before they knew what it was. Residents in Dumbo looked out their windows at the empty streets below and felt it. Business owners near the Brooklyn Bridge who caught the news alerts on their phones felt it. The overnight staff at Brooklyn's 84th Precinct felt it in the particular way that law enforcement feels things. As a tightening, a sharpening, a collective leaning forward that happens when the unknown becomes operational. Nobody slept easily in those hours. The ones who tried woke up again quickly. 3 news helicopters were airborne by 5 a.m., circling wide holding patterns over the harbor. Their cameras pointed at the bridge approaches. Their anchors filling dead air with speculation and careful language and the particular verbal padding that journalism uses when it knows something is coming but doesn't yet know what. Nobody knew what. At 5:44 a.m., the sound arrived before the image did. Came from across the water first. A low, sustained vibration that was felt in the chest before it was processed by the ear, traveling through the cold morning air across the harbor like a message sent in a frequency below ordinary language. People on the Brooklyn waterfront turned toward it instinctively, the way people always turn toward things that speak directly to something older than thought. Then the image came. 220 motorcycles in perfect formation crossing the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, 6 columns wide, moving with a synchronized discipline that looked less like a motorcycle convoy and more like something that had been rehearsed. The bridge lights caught the chrome. The death head patches caught the bridge lights. For news helicopters repositioned simultaneously, their cameras transmitting live to stations that interrupted regular programming without hesitation. Every phone in Brooklyn seemed to buzz at the same moment. The convoy moved through Bay Ridge without stopping, through Sunset Park, through Carroll Gardens. NYPD units shadowed it at a careful distance, close enough to respond, far enough to respect the instruction that had come down through channels at 4:17 a.m. An instruction so unexpected that the deputy commissioner had asked for it to be repeated twice before he accepted it. The instruction had come from the FBI. Said 4 words. Do not engage them. But it was the reason given after those 4 words that had turned the deputy commissioner's office completely silent and sent 3 senior investigators scrambling for files that weren't supposed to exist anymore. Because the reason had nothing to do with the convoy. It had everything to do with the boy on the bridge. The sound hit the Brooklyn waterfront like a physical thing. Not loud the way an explosion is loud, sudden and violent and over before you've processed it. This was different. This was the kind of sound that built itself slowly from the distance, layer upon layer, growing in the chest before it ever reached the ears, until standing on the waterfront at 5:51 a.m. felt less like witnessing something and more like being inside it. People who had gathered along the Esplanade in Brooklyn Heights, Some in coats thrown over pajamas, some who had simply never gone to bed, stood completely still as it approached. Nobody spoke. There was an unspoken collective understanding that whatever was coming deserved silence as its reception. The fog was still heavy off the East River, thick enough that the convoy was heard for a full 40 seconds before it was seen. And then the lights came through first, a long, unbroken line of headlights materializing out of the gray like something emerging from another world, and the crowd on the waterfront made a sound of its own. Not a cheer, not a scream. Something involuntary and low that comes from the part of a person that responds to scale before the rational mind has time to contextualize it. 220 motorcycles in 6 columns, moving across the Brooklyn waterfront approach in a formation so precise it looked engineered. The riders sat straight, unhurried, their movements absorbed into the collective rhythm of the convoy, the way individual instruments disappear into an orchestra when everything is working exactly as it should. Leather cuts with death head patches caught the pale morning light. Chrome caught the bridge lights above. The exhaust breath of 220 engines rose into the cold air in a single continuous cloud that drifted east over the river like weather. For news helicopters tracked them from above, their cameras feeding live to every major network that had preempted morning programming without a second's hesitation. A producer at one Midtown studio later said it was the easiest call she'd made in 11 years. You don't cut away from 220 Hells Angels riding in formation through Brooklyn at dawn. You clear the desk and you watch. The convoy moved through Bay Ridge without deviation. Through Sunset Park. Through Carroll Gardens and Dumbo. The streets cleared by a combination of the early hour and the particular human instinct that empties a path for something it doesn't fully understand. NYPD units held their shadowing formation, close enough to be present, far enough to honor the 4 words that had come down through federal channels 6 hours earlier. Officers in those units said later that the discipline of the convoy was the most disorienting part. There was no aggression, no theater, no acknowledgement of the cameras or the crowds or the helicopters overhead. Just 220 men moving toward a fixed point with the quiet certainty of people who had made a decision and were now simply executing it. They reached the Brooklyn Bridge at 6:09 a.m. The convoy slowed as it approached the pedestrian and vehicle lanes, moving to the section of bridge where the damaged guardrail still bore the evidence of what had happened 7 hours earlier. Bent metal, scraped marks in the paint, a dark stain in the frost that anyone who looked directly at it understood immediately. The lead motorcycle stopped at that exact point. The ones behind it stopped in sequence, a wave of stillness moving backward through the formation until all 220 engines died within 4 seconds of each other. The silence was catastrophic. That was the word a journalist used in her live broadcast and then immediately second-guessed before deciding it was the only accurate word available. Catastrophic silence. The kind that arrives when something enormous stops and the world hasn't caught up yet to the absence of it. The gathered crowd, now several hundred people deep along both bridge approaches, plus the cameras, plus the officers, plus the residents leaning from windows in the buildings overlooking the bridge entrance, held that silence like something they'd been handed and weren't sure how to put down. Iron Duke dismounted alone. He handed nothing to anyone. He said nothing to anyone. He simply swung off his motorcycle with the unhurried movement of a man entirely alone with his purpose, and he walked to the damaged guardrail, and he stopped in front of it. He looked at the bent metal for a long moment. Then he reached out and placed both palms flat against it. Against the exact section that had held the weight of his daughter and the weight of a boy he didn't know, while 130 feet of frozen darkness waited below. He bowed his head. 220 men behind him. Not one moved. Not one spoke. The helicopters held their altitude. The cameras kept rolling. The crowd on the bridge approach did not make a sound. He stayed that way for 90 seconds. It was the most watched 90 seconds of silence in New York that year. When he lifted his head and straightened his back, something in the quality of the air shifted. He turned to face his men. He looked at them for a moment. Just looked, the way a man looks at something he trusts completely, and then he gave one single nod. What happened next dismantled every assumption every person watching had constructed over the previous 6 hours. Toolboxes came off saddlebags. Not weapons. Not anything that confirmed the threat assessment that law enforcement had been running since 4 a.m. Toolboxes. Work gloves snapped onto hands that had been clenched into fists during the entire ride. Welding equipment emerged from the support vehicles that had been trailing the convoy. 3 modified cargo vans that nobody in the media coverage had paid sufficient attention to. Steel plating. Industrial cleaning supplies. Replacement guardrail components that had been measured and cut before dawn, before the convoy ever left Newark. 220 Hells Angels members went to work on the Brooklyn Bridge. The silence broke then, but not the way anyone had anticipated. It broke into the sound of tools and metal and men working with the focused efficiency of a crew that had planned this down to the component. A repair job that the New York City Department of Transportation had logged that morning as a 3-week contracted project. Closed lane, safety scaffolding, union crew, the full municipal process, was being disassembled and addressed by men in leather cuts who moved like they'd been building things their entire lives, which most of them had. The live broadcast anchors stopped speaking for nearly 30 seconds. One of them, a veteran reporter named Curtis Aldane who had covered New York for 22 years, said simply, and the line was clipped and replayed thousands of times before the morning was over, "I have covered this city for 2 decades and I have no template for what I am watching right now." The videos hit every platform simultaneously. The comments sections filled faster than the moderation systems could process. People across the country watched 220 Hells Angels repair a bridge in the early morning light of a Brooklyn February and felt something shift inside their understanding of a word they thought they already knew the definition of. That word was loyalty, but not everyone watching felt the warmth of it. In the press area established by the NYPD on the South Approach, a journalist named Brianna Solis, the same New York One reporter who had flagged the convoy movement at 3:30 a.m., was not watching the bridge repair. She was sitting in the New York One mobile unit, laptop open, a security footage file running on her screen that the NYPD Public Information Office had released to credentialed media 2 hours earlier as part of standard incident documentation. She had been cross-referencing the footage with 3 different databases for 40 minutes, a habit she'd developed covering federal crime cases for 6 years before moving to general assignment. It was the kind of methodical, unremarkable background work that most journalists at a scene like this had abandoned in favor of the camera-ready story unfolding on the bridge. Brianna had a feeling the real story wasn't on the bridge. The facial recognition query she'd run through a publicly accessible federal missing persons database, the same tool available to any credentialed journalist with the right access tier, had returned a result 11 minutes ago. She'd been staring at it since. Reading it. Rereading it, making sure she understood what she was looking at before she did anything with it. Because what she was looking at didn't make sense. The boy in the security footage, the one who had saved Kayla Reyes and disappeared into the fog before a single officer got his name, had returned a match. But not to a missing child report. Not to a runaway alert. Not to anything that fit the story everyone was already writing about a nameless homeless teenager who had done something extraordinary on a bridge in the middle of the night. The match that came back was flagged at federal level. Restricted access. Partial visibility before the file locked. But Brianna had seen enough. The boy wasn't just a witness to what happened on that bridge. He was a witness in something else entirely. Something federal. Something that had been active for over a year out of a district court in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She reached for her phone, and then she stopped, because in the reflection of her laptop screen, she saw something in the window of the mobile unit behind her. A man, standing outside, looking directly at her. Not at the bridge, not at the convoy, at her screen. He'd been there long enough to have seen exactly what she was reading, and when their eyes met in the reflection, he didn't look away. He smiled. The man outside the window was gone by the time Brianna turned around. Not hurrying away. Not ducking out of sight. Simply gone, the way a person disappears when they were never meant to be seen in the first place and the only mistake they made was being seen anyway. The space where he'd been standing held nothing. Just the cold morning air and the distant sound of tools on metal drifting down from the bridge, and the faint impression on Brianna's nervous system of something she couldn't immediately name but felt with complete certainty. She sat very still for a moment. Then she closed her laptop, slid it into her bag, and made two decisions simultaneously. The first was that she was not going to mention what she'd found to her editor until she understood it better. The second was that she was not going to be alone in this press area any longer than necessary. She picked up her phone and walked back toward the camera crew and the lights in the crowd, and she didn't look behind her, because she understood instinctively that looking behind her would confirm a fear she wasn't ready to confirm yet. 3 miles away, in a warming shelter on Myrtle Avenue in Bushwick, Dion was asleep. He had made it to the foot. Green shelter on DeKalb Avenue with 6 minutes to spare, stayed 2 hours, then left before dawn the way he always did, early enough to avoid the complications that came with staying too long in any one place. He'd walked to the NYC Relief Collective on Myrtle Avenue instead, a place he'd been using for 3 weeks because the overnight coordinator there, a heavy-set woman named Gloria, asked fewer questions than most and kept a corner near the radiator informally reserved for the regulars who needed it most. He was in that corner now, jacket pulled over his face, backpack wedged between his body and the wall the way he always slept, close enough to feel if anyone touched it. Around him the shelter held its usual 2 a.m. population of bodies in various states of exhaustion, the room carrying its permanent smell of damp clothing and industrial soap and the particular human heaviness of accumulated hardship. He had not turned on a phone. He did not own one. He had not seen a television or a news alert or any of the footage that was, at this exact moment, being watched by several million people across the country. He did not know that the girl he'd pulled from the bridge railing 7 hours ago had whispered a name that was currently sitting at the center of the largest law enforcement conversation in the northeastern United States. He did not know that 220 motorcycles were parked on the Brooklyn Bridge 3 miles from where he was sleeping. And he did not know that the man sleeping 6 tables away from him, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with close-cropped gray at his temples who went by Pete and volunteered for the Tuesday food line and had been at the shelter for exactly as many days as Dion had, was not what he appeared to be. He did not know any of it. He was just a boy trying to get through the night. 9 months earlier, Dion had been a different kind of invisible. Not the invisibility of the streets, where people look through you because you've been categorized and filed and set aside by the part of the human mind that manages its own discomfort. The invisibility of an ordinary life, school, routine, the background noise of a neighborhood that didn't make the news for anything good but held its own dignity in the spaces between the hard things. He and his mother Vivian had lived in a narrow apartment on Homewood Avenue in Pittsburgh's Homewood neighborhood, a place with a front window that faced a vacant lot and a back window that faced a neighbor's garden, and Vivian had always said the back window was the one worth having. She worked double shifts at UPMC Presbyterian. She made enough. They managed. On a Tuesday night in May, Dion had been cutting through the Strip District waterfront on his way back from a friend's place on Penn Avenue, a route he'd taken a dozen times before because it was faster than the bus and he was 16 and time felt abundant in the way it only does before the world teaches you otherwise. He saw the meeting through a gap in the loading dock fencing. He didn't understand what he was seeing immediately. Men in leather cuts. A figure in a dark jacket handing something to one of them. A case, sealed, passed with the brisk efficiency of a transaction that had been completed many times before. A third man standing slightly apart from the others, watching the exchange with the administrative composure of someone overseeing a process rather than participating in it. The third man wore no cuts. He wore a dark jacket and carried himself with a particular kind of institutional stillness that Dion, even at 16, recognized as belonging to a specific category of professional. He would later be able to describe every detail of that man's face with the precision of someone who drew portraits for pleasure and had the particular memory for human features that comes with that practice. He should have kept walking. He understood that immediately afterward, and every day since. But he'd stood there for 40 seconds too long, and in those 40 seconds the man in the dark jacket turned and looked directly at the fence line. directly at the gap. Dion walked away without running because running would have been worse, and he understood that too. He walked 4 blocks before his legs started shaking. 3 days later, 2 federal investigators knocked on Vivian's door. The case they described to her over the next 2 hours was layered and complex and reduced itself, in terms of what it meant for Dion, to one essential fact. Her son was the only eyewitness who could place a specific individual at a specific location at a specific time, and that individual was a federal contractor with security clearance whose presence at that meeting made the entire prosecution structurally viable in a way it currently was not. A witness protection arrangement was activated within 72 hours. Collapsed in 48. Dion never knew exactly how. What he knew was that Vivian was approached outside UPMC Presbyterian on a Wednesday evening by 2 men who communicated their message without words and left her with a fractured wrist and 3 cracked ribs, and a fear so total that she called Dion from the hospital floor and told him to run before she called anyone else. He ran north. It was the only direction that felt like distance. In the warming shelter on Myrtle Avenue, something woke him. Not a sound. Not a touch. The specific quality of the air in a room changing, the way it changes when attention enters it and focuses. The instinct that 7 months of street survival had built into the base of his nervous system registered it before his conscious mind caught up, and he was already pulling the jacket from his face and sitting up before he'd fully processed why. Wrench Dominguez was sitting across from him. He had pulled a chair from the nearest table and placed it 3 feet from Dion's corner and sat in it with the patient stillness of a man who was comfortable waiting and had been doing exactly that, waiting, watching, for long enough to be certain of what he was looking at. He was a large man, broad through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of face that had been rearranged by life a few times and had settled into something that communicated a great deal without expressing much. He wore no cuts tonight. Just a dark jacket and work boots and the unmistakable quality of someone who didn't need visible symbols to communicate what they were. Dion knew who he was anyway. The recognition moved across his face in a single controlled wave. The flash of it, then the suppression of the flash, and Wrench watched it happen with the expression of someone who had expected it. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Wrench reached into his jacket with 2 fingers. Slowly, deliberately, the gesture of a man being careful to be readable, and placed a phone on the floor between them. Screen facing up. A video call already connected and waiting. Dion looked at the screen. Iron Duke looked back at him. The older man's face was still. Not hostile. Not warm. The face of a man in the process of understanding something he needed to understand completely before he decided what it meant. Then Wrench reached into his other pocket and placed 2 photographs on the floor beside the phone. The first was a surveillance image, grainy, time-stamped, taken outside the Strip District waterfront in Pittsburgh. The loading dock, the exchange, the men in cuts, and the figure in the dark jacket with his face turned slightly toward the fence line. Dion's jaw tightened when he saw it. Then Wrench placed the second photograph beside the first. This one was clear, recent, taken inside a building Dion recognized immediately because he was sitting in it. The man in the photograph was standing at the volunteer registration desk near the shelter entrance. The timestamp in the lower corner read 11 days ago. His shelter badge was visible. It read Pete. Community outreach in clean printed letters. Dion stared at the photograph for a long time. Then Wrench spoke for the first time. His voice was low, unhurried, and carried the particular weight of information delivered by someone who understands exactly what it will cost the person receiving it. He said that Pete's real name was Deputy Marshal Clifton Haverford, Pittsburgh Field Office, and that Haverford had arrived at the NYC Relief Collective on Myrtle Avenue 3 days after Dion did. Dion's eyes moved slowly across the shelter floor toward the entrance. The man who called himself Pete was standing in the doorway. He was looking directly at Dion, and his right hand was already moving toward the inside of his jacket. Nobody in that shelter moved. Not because they didn't sense it. People who live on the margins develop a finer sensitivity to danger than most, a kind of peripheral awareness that doesn't require direct information to function. They felt the shift in the room the way animals feel a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm arrives. Conversations dropped. Eyes went to plates. Bodies angled away from the entrance with the practiced, unconscious self-preservation of people who had learned that the space between you and trouble is the only currency that never loses its value. Pete, Clifton Haverford, stood in the doorway with his right hand inside his jacket and his eyes fixed on Dion with the focused, calculating expression of a man running a rapid assessment. How many exits? How many bodies between him and his target? How much time before the variables shifted against him? His hand stayed where it was, not drawing, not retreating, waiting on the calculation to complete. What he hadn't calculated was wrench. If this story found you at this moment, right here at the edge of something that is about to break open, then you already know this channel doesn't do half measures. Like this video, subscribe, and stay with us, because what happens in the next few minutes of this story is the part nobody who watched it ever forgot. Wrench didn't stand up quickly. He didn't reach for anything. He simply turned his head toward the doorway and looked at Haverford with an expression so completely empty of alarm that it functioned as its own form of communication. The communication of a man who has been in worse rooms than this one and has always been the last person standing in them. He held that look for 3 seconds. Then he reached into his jacket with 2 deliberate fingers and placed his own phone on the floor, screen up, showing a live call with a single name displayed at the top. Haverford read the name from the doorway. His hand came out of his jacket empty. He stood there for another moment, the particular stillness of a man absorbing a recalculation. And then he turned and walked out of the shelter without a word, without rushing, the door closing behind him with a sound so ordinary it seemed to belong to a different story entirely. Dion let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like the length of his entire life. What followed happened across 36 hours that Dion would spend the rest of his life trying to organize into a sequence that made linear sense, and never quite managing it. It didn't feel linear. It felt like several different realities colliding simultaneously and leaving behind a single altered landscape where nothing was positioned quite where it had been before. Iron Duke arrived in New York the following morning. Not with 220 men. With 3 Wrench and 2 others whose names Dion was never given and didn't ask for. The restraint of it, after the spectacle of the convoy, was more communicative than any show of force could have been. It said that this particular visit was not about power. It was about something that required fewer witnesses. The meeting happened in a private room above a Portuguese restaurant on Ferry Street in Newark. A room with no windows and 1 door, and a table large enough for 4 people who needed to have a conversation that the rest of the world was not invited to. Iron Duke sat on one side. FBI agent Renata Okafor sat on the other, flanked by a representative from the U.S. Attorney's office in Manhattan whose name Dion was told but immediately forgot, because some people occupy a room as a function rather than a person, and this man was entirely that. Dion sat in a chair against the wall and listened to the architecture of his own life being described by people who had been studying it from the outside for longer than he'd known they existed. Agent Okafor laid it out with the precise, undecorated delivery of someone who had been carrying classified weight for a long time and was relieved to be setting it down. The faction operating under Hell's Angels branding across 4 states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Maryland. Running infrastructure fraud through legitimate city contracts, moving money through municipal systems so thoroughly embedded that the prosecution had been unable to find a thread loose enough to pull until a 16-year-old boy stood at a fence line in Pittsburgh for 40 seconds too long. Then she laid out the part about Haverford, his position in the Pittsburgh Marshal's office, the access that position gave him to witness protection arrangements. The financial relationship he had maintained for 14 months with the same faction he was supposedly helping to prosecute. Selling witness locations, burning protection arrangements before they could be activated, eliminating testimony the way a careful editor eliminates inconvenient facts. The room was quiet when she finished. Iron Duke had not moved during the entire briefing. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on Okafor and the expression of a man processing something that required more interior space than was immediately available. Then he did something that nobody in that room, Not Okafor, not the attorney, not Wrench standing by the door, had anticipated. He asked about Vivian, Dion's mother, still hospitalized in Pittsburgh, still carrying the physical evidence of what Haverford's associates had communicated to her outside UPMC Presbyterian on a Wednesday evening 9 months ago. Iron Duke asked about her recovery, about her care, about what she needed, with the quiet specificity of a man who had already decided he was going to do something about the answers before he heard them. Okafor told him. He nodded once and said nothing further on the subject. But Wrench made a phone call 20 minutes later from the hallway outside the room, and 3 days after that, Vivian Castillo was transferred to a private rehabilitation facility in a detail that the U.S. Attorney's representative technically had no knowledge of and made no effort to acquire. Iron Duke's declaration, when it came, was not negotiated. He didn't bargain. He didn't offer conditions or request guarantees or do any of the transactional maneuvering that the room had been quietly bracing for. He simply stated two things as facts and looked at Okafor while he stated them. The first was that he would provide her office with documentation his organization had been accumulating for 8 months. Evidence against the corrupt faction and against Haverford's operation that federal investigators had not been able to obtain through their own channels. Not because it served him strategically, because the faction had operated under his name without his knowledge or sanction, and that was a debt that existed independent of legality or consequence. The second was that Dion would receive real protection, properly structured, personally overseen by Okafor with direct accountability to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The kind that didn't leak. Okafor agreed to both without hesitation. The U.S. Attorney's representative went slightly pale and said nothing, which in that room constituted consent. Deputy Marshal Clifton Haverford was arrested 4 days later at a budget motel in Weehawken, New Jersey, at 6:20 in the morning. There was no press conference, no cameras, no perp walk down a courthouse corridor for the evening news. 2 federal agents knocked on his door, and he opened it in a white undershirt and the arrested man's expression. That specific compound of resignation and relief that appears on the face of someone who has been running long enough to be tired of it, and that was the entirety of the theater. The quietness of it was its own kind of verdict. Kayla was discharged from Bellevue on a gray Tuesday morning with Iron Duke on her left and Trent on her right, and she asked before she got into the car if she could see Dion first. They met in a small family waiting room on the 3rd floor. 2 chairs pulled close. Just the 2 of them, which was how it needed to be. She didn't cry. She didn't reach for the language of gratitude that the moment might have licensed her to use. She just looked at him with the direct, clear attention of someone who had been very close to not being in any room ever again and understood exactly what that meant now. Then she asked him why he hadn't kept walking. Dion reached into his backpack, pulled out the worn sketchbook with the rubber band around its spine, opened it to a page near the middle and turned it toward her without a word. It was her face, drawn with the careful, practiced precision of someone who rendered faces from memory as a way of holding onto a world that kept moving too fast. Detailed enough that there was no question about the subject. No ambiguity. No way to look at it and see anyone else. Kayla looked at the sketch for a long time. Then she looked at the date written in the lower corner in Dion's small, exact handwriting. For months before the night on the bridge. The room held that information in silence for a moment that neither of them attempted to fill with words, because there were no words structured correctly for what they were both sitting inside. Outside the window, the East River moved south toward the harbor the way it always did. Indifferent, constant, carrying everything on its surface for a while before releasing it to the open water beyond. The Brooklyn Bridge was visible from the 3rd floor if you stood close to the glass. Its lights were on in the gray morning. The repaired guardrail caught the pale light the same as the sections around it. You could not tell from this distance what had happened there, but Dion knew. And somewhere in a sealed envelope that Wrench had delivered to the shelter on Myrtle Avenue the previous evening. An envelope that sat unopened in Dion's backpack throughout the entire meeting in Newark, throughout Haverford's arrest, throughout Kayla's discharge, was something that meant the knowing went deeper than anyone had told him yet. He opened it that night. Alone, in the first safe room he'd occupied in 9 months. A properly secured location that Agent Okafor had arranged with the kind of institutional thoroughness that made it feel, for the first time, like something that might actually hold. Inside the envelope was a single photocopied letter. Handwritten. Dated 14 months ago. It was addressed to Aurelio Reyes. It described a boy in Pittsburgh who had seen something he shouldn't have seen, and asked Iron Duke to ensure that boy's safety quietly, without federal involvement, because the federal system had already been compromised in ways the letter's author claimed to be able to document. Dion read it twice. Then he turned to the signature at the bottom. The name written there was his father's. A man Vivian had told him died before he was born. Dion sat with that information in the quiet of the first safe room he'd had in 9 months, and outside the window New York continued its permanent, indifferent business of being New York, and the East River moved south the way it always had, and somewhere across that water 220 motorcycles were parked in garages from Newark to Providence, their engines cooling, their riders home, their debt to a boy they'd never met discharged in the only language they had ever fully trusted. The language of showing up.